Thanks for coming. Welcome to Books and Books. My name is Becky. I do the kids and young adult events here, and I'm very excited for tonight's author. I ask you now to please turn off your cell phones if you have one. Pick up a calendar if you haven't already done so. We have plenty of events coming up. Melissa de la Cruz is next week. Mary Lou is in November, so come back for something else. Tonight, I would like to first introduce you to a good friend of the bookstore and one of the best librarians I know, Melanie Fernandez.
Good evening. I'm Melanie Fernandez, and I'm honored to introduce our featured author, Elizabeth Wein. Although she was born in New York City, she lived in England and Jamaica as a young child, and she later returned to the United States. She went to Yale University and spent a work-study year in England. Her next move to Philadelphia was filled with exciting and different adventures. She received her Ph.D. in folklore at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where she held a Javits Fellowship. Interestingly, she learned to ring church bells in the English style known as change ringing. Not only did the change ringing work well for her, but she received another ring in the form of marriage from her future husband, whom she met in 1991 at a bell ringer's dinner dance. She married Tim and they moved to England and then to Scotland in 2000. They have 2 children. They both share a love of flying, and together they have flown in the States and Kenya on the coast and all over southern England. Alone, most of her flying has been over eastern Scotland. Her interest in flying is what sparked the idea for Codename Verity and her new novel, Rose Under Fire. Her first 5 books for young adults are set in Arthurian Britain and 6th century Ethiopia. The most recent of these form the sequence, The Mark of Solomon, published in 2 parts as The Lion Hunter and The Empty Kingdom. Her recent novel for teens ventures into a totally new direction. Codename Verity is a World War II thriller in which 2 girls, one a resistance spy and the other a transport pilot, become unlikely best friends. It has received widespread critical acclaim, including the 2013 Edgar Award, a Prince Honor Book, a Boston Globe Horn Book Award, Golden Kite Honor Book, and not to mention that it is a New York Times bestseller in young adult fiction and top 10 in the Goodreads Choice Award for its category. One only needs to look at the reviews of Codename Verity to find the landslide accolades that she has received for this compelling story, described as haunting, exceptional, well-researched, and expertly crafted, riveting, brutal, crushingly sad, and hugely inspirational, and even downright sizzling. And now we have her newest book, Rose Under Fire, a companion to Codename Verity. We are introduced to American ATA pilot and amateur poet, Rose Justice. While flying an Allied fighter plane from Paris to England, she is captured by the Nazis and sent to Ravensbrück, the notorious women's concentration camp. At this point, I'm ready to take a seat or take a pew and hand over the floor to our author, Elizabeth Wein. Elizabeth, welcome.
Boy, I have to say, after an introduction like that, it really can only be anticlimactic to actually have me talking to you. I don't see how I can possibly live up to all the accolades. I want to say thank you to Books and Books for having me here. I'm really kind of envious of the wonderful space and the wonderful bookstore that you have here. And I want to particularly say welcome to all you young people sitting in the back there, because I have done a number of bookstore events, and usually I can count on one finger the number of teens that are in the audience. And I'm not really sure why that is, but I'm really happy to see some younger faces here. So I'm glad you're here. Were any of you at the Ronald Reagan High School? Were any of you at the school visit I did? Okay, so you're here independently of that. I'm going to read to you a bit from Rose Under Fire, because really the reason I'm here is I'm supposed to be like on tour promoting Rose Under Fire. And it's kind of the first time I've done this. And it's the first time I've ever been on a book tour, but it's also the first time that I've really read a substantial chunk of Rose Under Fire. And I have to tell you that one of the things that happens to Rose after she has escaped from and survived this concentration camp, she is taxed by the other people there to tell their story and to bear witness to what she saw. And she actually finds this very difficult to do because she can't talk about what happened to her. And so it's therefore very hard to talk about what happened to everybody else. And I have kind of, worried that someone is going to ask me, as they ask Rose, to come and read her poetry aloud somewhere, and I'm going to stand up there and go, no, I can't actually, and then I'll have to be dragged out and given a glass of wine while somebody else reads them. So hopefully I've chosen a scene, and I'm not sure how long this will take, because as I say, I haven't done it before, but I've chosen a scene that I think will give you some idea of her character, and also some idea of what I've tried to portray in this story. And what I say in the author's note is that although all the characters, almost all the characters in the book are imaginary, all the main characters are imaginary. There's one exception, and that's the medical witness. There's a scene which takes place at the Nazi Nuremberg trials afterwards, and the medical witness there was a real person. The only other real people are just mentioned in passing. Apart from him, all the main characters are made up. But what is described as happening to them, the work they had to do, the things they had to suffer, really happened to real people. So the part that I'm reading you, although it's made up and put in the mouth of this character, is, it was real. And what I'm going to read you is from pretty much the beginning of Rose's time in Ravensbrück. She starts out working in a factory. When she's caught, she's basically told she's going to be a skilled worker, and she's got a recommendation from the people who catch her. And it's a hard life, but it isn't actually too bad. And I think she actually tells you a bit about that. So I'm going to shut up and let Rose tell you her own story here. This is no longer me talking. When my quarantine was finished, they sent me over to the Siemens Factory. They just hauled me out of my row in roll call and stuffed me into a smaller group of 20 other women, not from my French transport. They marched us out through the big gates and along the lake. I got a glimpse of the SS staff housing. There were neat, long swathes of red flowers bordering their front yards, and window boxes. A woman in civilian clothes was sweeping up leaves with a couple of tiny tot kids, and the kids were throwing leaves at each other, and they were all laughing. They looked so ordinary. My heart lifted a little. I was outside those terrible walls again. The last 3 weeks hadn't been easy, but they were over, and I was out. It is a longish walk from the main camp to Siemens, about half a mile. You could see Fürstenberg and its church spire across the lake, like a scenes from old Europe picture on a jigsaw puzzle. On our side of the lake, we passed hundreds of Ravensbrück prisoners, busy at something or other, cutting reeds, hauling potatoes and firewood from somewhere, unloading barges of coal. Finally, we came to another complex of long gray buildings behind chain link and barbed wire electrified fences that was the Siemens Factory itself. Around the buildings here, other prisoners were doing hard labor, unloading iron pigs from railway cars and dragging them away in wagon loads. But this is where my Luftwaffe letter of recommendation suddenly kicked in. The Luftwaffe is the German Air Force. Thank God, I thought as I realized what was going on. Thank you, Luftwaffe Commander. Thank you, Karl Wilmersdorf. I sat in an office and had to do a couple of aptitude tests. No language aptitude required. Guide a thread around a series of tacks on a board and fold a piece of paper in a particular way, following visual instructions. Finally, I had to learn to wind thin copper wire around an iron bobbin. And then I had a skilled job, just like they'd told me I would. Technically, it was even a paid job, though nobody ever gave you any money. They just jotted down your wages against your number. I sat at a bench under bright electric lights in a relatively clean and airy factory barracks, wrapping strands of copper wire around iron bobbins. The factory was decent because German civilians from Fürstenberg worked there too. I was a prisoner, but I was healthy and clean enough that I could work in the same room with normal people, though we weren't allowed to speak to each other, not that I could. The dorms at Siemens were cleaner too and less crowded. We were still 3 to a bed, but the mattresses were better, and we had 2 blankets among the 3 of us, and the toilet worked. We were all issued kerchiefs to cover up how savagely some of us had been scalped. I missed Elodie like crazy, and most of my ill-gotten belongings, toothbrush, soap, etc., were still hidden in a crack between the boards of my never-to-be-revisited bunk in the quarantine block. But I didn't meet anyone in my new barracks who spoke either French or English. But, see, I'd waited out the dreadful quarantine, believing my life would improve, and it did. I lasted 3 days. That's counting the time I stood at my bench, doing nothing for 18 hours, waiting for someone to shoot me. It wasn't that I couldn't do the work. The summer before my senior year in high school, I worked at the paper box factory in Mount Jericho. It was the same kind of work, just folding and sticking on an assembly line. Actually, it was worse at the paper box factory because the air was so dusty and it was so hot that summer, and it was so boring. The only interesting thing that happened the whole summer was when Polly put that cigarette butt in her pocket and set her apron on fire. The work was worth it. I needed the money for coming to England. But it wasn't a fun job, and I stuck with it and was pleased with myself afterward. Okay, here I was on another assembly line doing work that I knew I could handle and hoping for the war to end at any minute. So why did I go and ruin it all? I blame it on a couple of civilian workers, although that's not really fair. I'd have figured it out on my own eventually. I heard them talking when we were coming in after the dinner break, and I heard a German word that I recognized. Vergeltungswaffe, vengeance weapon. I filed meekly back to my place at the long table full of copper wire and iron spools, and in the back of my head, the word was echoing over and over with the clattering rhythm of an approaching flying bomb. Vergeltungswaffe, Vergeltungswaffe. I sat down. I picked up a piece of copper wire. I was making electrical relays. I was making electrical relays for flying bombs, for their fuses. I put down the piece of wire. Then I just sat there staring at it for 20 minutes. I was so quiet, so utterly unfussy, that it took 20 minutes for anyone to notice I had stopped working. At least, it took the foreman 20 minutes to notice. The prisoners on either side of me didn't say anything. They just quietly beavered away at their own electrical relays. The foreman eventually came over and gave me a gentle prod in the ribs with the end of a ruler. The civilians didn't like to touch the Ravensbrück prisoners, and no wonder. Even when we were clean, we were still livid with bug bites. My shins were so bitten they looked sunburned. I knew exactly what the ruler poke meant. He didn't have to say anything in any language. I wanted to be willing. God knows I wanted to cooperate. I didn't want to get in trouble. I picked up the wire thread, and I just couldn't do it. Now this I remember like it was this morning. I watch my hands writing here on the vanity table in the Paris Ritz, and I can see it happening. I picked up the wire thread, wrapped it once around the spool, and I saw my friend Maddie's hands instead of mine. Just in a blinking flash, Maddie's pretty, capable hands, with the old French-cut ruby sparkling on her ring finger, taking apart the bomb fuse that Uncle Roger had sent me. I closed my eyes to make it go away. My own hands were still frozen in place over the new relay. And when I closed my eyes, I saw that little boy's hands from my nightmare, small, dirty fingers blown to bloody splinters. And I just couldn't do it. It wasn't a conscious decision. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't my conscience nagging at me. It wasn't anything noble. God knows I wouldn't have been brave enough to do anything noble. But now that I knew what I was making, I just couldn't do it. I laid the wire gently on the table. Then I laid my hands in my lap. The foreman called over the SS guard who was in charge of the prison workers. Gosh, they gave no quarter, those SS guards. They didn't waste any time, ever. This one didn't even try to talk to me. She took hold of my skull, just grabbed me by the back of my head, and slammed my forehead down on the table. For a moment, it felt like my head had exploded, sparkling light everywhere. Then she shifted her grip on my head to force me back upright, and with her free hand, she picked up the strand of copper wire and tossed it on the table in front of me. Beneath her grip, I shook my head sadly. No. She slammed my face back down on the table, and I have got a scar just above my left eye where the copper wire cut me. It's so thin you probably can't see it, and I am not brave enough to look, but I can feel it, and I know it's there. I count it as a flying bomb scar. The guard let go of my head. Aufstehen. Get up. You got to know what that meant after a while because you had to do it so much. They didn't do anything else, just made me stand up. The copper wire and relay bobbins I was supposed to be working on still lay there on the table in front of me. The prisoners around me were still hunched over their own relays, just the way they'd been when I first stopped working, diligently trying not to notice what was going on. It was like when I took the bomb fuse from the boy on the railway line in Hamble in England. I was sure I was going to be killed. And it made me sad. Not scared, but sad that I had forced myself into this corner where I just couldn't win. But they didn't kill me. They didn't even hit me again. They just made me stand there. I stood there for the rest of the day, and all night, and into the next day. People came and went around me. Production went on during the night, so everybody changed shifts around me, and I went on standing there. They kept an eye on me. There were a couple of extra guards brought in, especially for me. They wouldn't let me touch the long table with my hands or lean against the bench. It got harder and harder not to. I started dreaming about my crowded bunk with its thin mattress and shared blanket. The copper wire on the table in front of me danced and gleamed beneath the harsh factory lights. I heard the screaming sirens go and thought smugly through the days of exhaustion, I've missed 2 roll calls. Not that I'd have been doing anything else in a roll call except just standing there. In the middle of the night, when I'd been on my feet for probably more than 12 hours, and of course I'd been working for 6 hours before that, and awake since the 4 a.m. siren the previous day, there was a point where all I wanted to do was lie down under the table and go to sleep. If I couldn't do that, then I might as well be dead. I was pretty sure I didn't care anymore. I'd reached the point where I thought I would do anything to be allowed to sit down. So very carefully, I stepped over the bench and sat down and picked up the copper wire that was waiting for me. It was bliss, sheer bliss to sit down, even though I was still sitting upright. Bliss just to be allowed to sit. I didn't think I'd get away with just sitting there, though. I was showing them they won, and I was going to have to go back to work. I knew they'd make me finish up the rest of that shift or make up the time I'd wasted. So I started to wrap the wire around the spool. And you know what? I still couldn't do it. I put the wire down quietly. I put my hands on the table and pushed myself to my feet somehow. And somehow I managed to climb back over the bench so I was standing behind it again. The other prisoners glanced up at me briefly and then away. Nobody smiled. The guards and the foreman chatted together for a while, and then the foreman took away my copper wire and the spools and gave them to someone else to finish up. They didn't do anything to me. They didn't hit me. They didn't make me leave the room, just made me go on standing there. Only while before it had been a battle of will between us, stand there till you feel like working, now I was being punished because I'd refused to work. This made everything a little different. Also, it woke me up. I'd sat down because I thought I'd been completely at the end of my strength. Obviously, I wasn't, but I was pretty close to it. And now I no longer had a way out. I knew this. Also, now I didn't know where the whole thing was going, and that was very frightening. So I had to readjust something in my head to help me focus on not losing my mind with fear and exhaustion. So I made up a poem. And actually, I remember now a thing that I was going to say earlier when we were talking about bravery and whether or not you would have the bravery to do what some of these incredibly brave people did. And what I realized about myself, and maybe I put some of this in Rose, is that if I ended up doing something incredibly brave, like, I don't know, punching a guard in the face or something because she had done something awful to one of the other prisoners, I wouldn't do that because I was brave. I would do that because I was mad. So I actually think that if I had been in this camp and in this place, I probably would not have survived, and it wouldn't be because I wasn't necessarily capable of surviving. It was because I would have at some point lost my temper to the point where I would have done something stupid and got myself executed. And that was kind of a revelation about myself. So, but it also made me feel a little better because I sort of thought, well, I probably would do the right thing. It would be the stupid thing to do, but it would probably be the right thing to do. Rose is a little more level-headed than me, and she just tends to not be able to make herself do anything other than the right thing. She doesn't really think of it as bravery. So, yeah, this book was very hard to write because it is set in a concentration camp, and you were really in the heads of the people who are there. You had to kind of put yourself in their place. And that's me kind of, telling you how it felt to read that, which was also an experience. Like I said, it's the first time I did it, and a little bit about how I felt to write it. What I've brought with me is my bag of show and tell stuff from of World War II paraphernalia and facsimile World War II paraphernalia. And before I start hauling these things out of my bag, I would like to know how many people here have actually read Codename Verity? Okay, a little smattering of people. So this stuff will actually mean something to some of you, and it may just be of interest to others of you. Before I start taking it out of the bag, I want to say that Codename Verity and Rose Under Fire are actually very different books. Although they are connected by a couple of shared characters, and they take place during the same war, and they partly take place in the same organization, the Air Transport Auxiliary. They are really very different stories, and they are structured as different stories. So Codename Verity is a thriller. It's also a mystery. That's what the Edgar Award is for. It's for Best Mystery. It's okay. You didn't do it on purpose, I think. And it has lots and lots of plot twists. It's got two different narrators, and one of them is very unreliable, and the other one kind of puts a different spin on everything that the first one has told you. And there are big reveals, and there are characters who are not who you think they are, and it kind of goes on like this and takes you on really a very intense and nonstop trip. Rose Under Fire is much more straightforward. It only has one narrator, and she tells her story from beginning to end. And one of the interesting things about these books for me as a writer is that Codename Verity is really, it's about truth. They're both about truth, but Codename Verity is sort of about hiding the truth and different ways to tell the truth. You know, tell the truth, but tell it slant. Winston Churchill said that in wartime, truth is so precious, she must be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies. And so this is I didn't know that I wrote Codename Verity before I knew that. Or I'd have used it. Yeah. And so that's what's going on in Codename. And it's in the title, you know, so the codename part is the disguise part, and verity is the word that means truth, you know, so there are all kinds of things going on. And what is truth in storytelling? Because part of what's going on in it is that there's a fictional account which actually reveals some emotional truths, okay? But with Rose Under Fire, not only Rose's point in telling the story, but much of my point in telling this story is to kind of uncover, to bear witness to a very unpleasant truth that I think is not really well known, because it's set in this women's concentration camp that is really quite different from some of the other concentration camps in the Nazi system. It was more political than racial. You know, it wasn't aimed at any particular group of people. It was except women, and that was one of the things that was different about it. And the women in that camp arranged themselves and their social units in a different way than the social units worked in other camps. So I wanted to kind of bring that to the forefront. And one of the other things that happens to Rose is that she eventually, what happens after that scene I just read you, is she's kind of basically booted back into the main camp, which is where the really horrible conditions are. And she is then kind of adopted by a group of Polish women who are known collectively as the rabbits. And that is because they were basically treated as experimental rabbits. And they had there are about 80 of them altogether. And they had a number of really horrible experiments performed on their legs, where muscle was stripped away, nerve was cut away. They tried to do bone transplants on them. They did experiments with gas gangrene to try to simulate war wounds so that they could, you know, figure out how to treat them, but they didn't actually follow through with these. And anyway, it was all very horrible. And these women were so determined they were going to get their story out that they managed to smuggle a message out to the Pope during the war with all their names on it, and he sent them a blessing in the camp. They managed to steal a camera and took pictures of their scars and managed to smuggle those out, and they were in fact developed and used as evidence at the trial afterwards. And they eventually ended up staging a rebellion, or actually being at the center of a rebellion that really involved the whole camp in the waning days of the war, when the administration was really falling apart and the Nazis were trying to cover up what they'd done because they didn't want anyone to figure out what was going on in these places, because they knew that there were going to be repercussions when the Allies figured out, you know, these things that had happened. So there was an attempt made to execute all these women, and the whole camp hid them. And they got the woman who was where it was actually a very self-sufficient place. You know, they grew their own food, they built their own buildings, they got people to work on the plumbing, and they had people who worked on the electricity. And one of the women in the power plant managed to cut the power at the roll calls at night, so that there was utter chaos because nobody could see anything. And they hid these women. And then they just kept shifting them around and hiding them. Everybody really banded together and kept these women from being caught. And they, in fact, managed to smuggle several of them out of the camp because at that point, lots of transports were coming and going. It was one of the places that they sent evacuees from Auschwitz to. And there were just thousands of people streaming in there every week and going out again. And some of them were executed and some of them were just sent somewhere else. So the administration was getting so chaotic that they were actually able to hide them. And these women, I'm not sure how many actually survived the war, but it was a goodly portion of them. And 15 years later, this is the coda that actually very few people know, but 15 years later, about half of them came to the United States. The medical expert, Leo Alexander, who had worked at the doctor's trial in Nuremberg, was really, really interested in these people. And he kind of spread the word about them, and a collection was made, and they got 35, I think, of these women to come to the United States, and they stayed there for a good portion of a year. And they did a tour, and they had medical treatment, and they had psychological treatment, and they visited the United Nations, and they were feasted by Jacob Javits in Washington, and some of them ended up actually, staying and marrying Americans, or staying and getting a college education or whatever. But it was this really kind of uplifting and interesting coda to what happened to these women, because you sort of think, okay, they're done, the war is over, hopefully they'll survive, and it was really, in some ways, as much of a happy ending as they could have. And I have found a picture, and actually it's on my website, of about 30 of them sitting in front of a cabin in Yosemite National Park in 1959. So you have to picture them a lot younger, because, of course, there's nobody in this picture who's under 30 at this point. But they're all sitting there and all really dressed up, and they're all wearing corsages for some reason. And they're all, just cheesing it up for the camera, and they look so beautiful and happy. And then if you look at their legs, their bare legs, because they're all wearing summer dresses, you can see the scars. They're very, very visible. So I do actually have that picture on my website, because I think they're so cool. But one of the things I really wanted to do in writing this book was to, let people know their story, because it's one of those stories that very few people have heard of. And that was a really long little detour before I get out my show and tell. So the show and tell, the World War II paraphernalia. When I wrote Codename Verity, and so I told you about Codename Verity, I told you about Rose Under Fire. They can be read separately. They can be also read, if you don't want to have the ending of Codename Verity spoiled for you by reading Rose Under Fire, you should read Codename Verity first, but you can read either one of them and understand exactly what's going on. You won't have any trouble picking up Rose Under Fire as the first one. So this is my gas mask bag. It's a civilian auxiliary forces respirator bag. It dates to about 1940. Every now and then somebody says, "Where did you get this stuff?" And the answer is, it all comes from eBay. And the reason I actually got this is because it's mentioned in Codename Verity. The civilians and the officials in the United Kingdom were really, really worried that civilian populations were going to be gassed. Were going to have chemical weapons used against them in the Second World War, and everybody had to, by regulation, carry a gas mask with them whenever they went anywhere. And most civilians had cardboard boxes to carry them in. But if you were in the auxiliary forces, you got a khaki one. And in here, I have all this loot that I got interested in as a result of doing the research for this book. So what we have here is a Royal Air Force map of the northeast of England. And this is actually pre-war. It dates to the mid-30s. But it is actually a pilot's map. I'm holding it right side up. Oh, darn it, this isn't the one I want to show you. I want to show you the one that has Manchester on it, which is labeled the Midlands, which isn't helpful, because I think of Manchester as being in the north. Okay. Right, so here we have, and this is where I started school, actually. My father was working for Head Start for the New York City Board of Education in the late 60s, and he was in Manchester doing teacher training. And so we lived in South Manchester. And when I tried to come up with a place to set Maddie's home, I chose Stockport because it was a city that I was relatively familiar with and felt like, and it was also kind of, it's a big enough city that you can make up things about it and it will feel like Stockport and it will still be anonymous. So it's the Stockport in the book is sort of made up, but it is one of the actual places whose name is actually used. The city in France where most of the book takes place, Ormay, is completely made up. It's loosely based on Poitiers, but there really is a place called Stockport. And so this would be the map that Maddie would be using in her early days of learning to fly with the I can't remember what they're called, but they did civilian training, basically. There was a civilian pilot training scheme prior to the war. And so the purple bit, the great big purple bit in the middle, that's the Pennines. Those are the really beautiful hills that kind of surround and dominate that countryside. And so then the other things we have in here are pilot's notes. So that map is a real map. These are all fakes. These are all facsimiles. But the reason I like to show these is because there's a good comparison to be made here. Now, Codename Verity, the characters in it are constantly struggling for paper. One of them is a prisoner. One of them is in hiding. The one who's a prisoner is dependent on people to supply her with paper. The one who's in hiding has to really take whatever she can get. And so she starts out by scribbling in the margins of her ferry pilot's notes. Now, this is also a facsimile. When I was writing the book, and this is the book that she supposedly scribbles in the margins of. And look, there are actually margins in it. When I was writing the book, I had not seen a copy of this. I didn't get a copy of this until about a year after I'd finished it, but before it was published. The best I could do, I read descriptions of it. I knew the size, I knew the format, but I didn't know what it actually looked like. And the best I could do was I found a photograph of a page from it in a magazine, and there was some white space. So I thought, yeah, okay, well, if there's white space on one page, there probably is some white space on another page. And then when I finally got this, I was delighted to discover that the back of some pages were completely blank. So that was okay. But one of the sort of entertaining things about this is, on the very first page, in bright red letters, it says, "This is an official document and is issued on loan only." This is dated 1941, whilst the recipient remains an authorized pilot of ATA. Its transfer, irregular use, loss by neglect, the disclosure of its contents to unauthorized persons, or its retention or destruction after the termination of the pilot's contract with the ATA are penal offenses and will be dealt with as such. Okay, so then I'm thinking, oh man, she probably shouldn't be writing in this. But I actually did discover, because this is a facsimile, there actually, I don't know where they are, but there are a few annotations in the margins. So I thought, okay, well, you know what, somebody, I mean, they were technical annotations, but when you're desperate, you're desperate. And what is interesting about this is that this was really the transport pilot's Bible in the United Kingdom. If you were actual pilot, fighter pilot or combat pilot, you would have the pilot's notes for whatever type of aircraft you were flying, and you would have a little book like this, which is Lysander pilot's notes. The Lysander is the plane that they used in Codename Verity. They use it in Codename Verity, but more than that, they used it in the Second World War for transporting agents and weapons and diplomats who had to be sneaked out of France under cover of darkness, because this plane had a very short takeoff and landing run. And so they could land it in fields, basically, at which they would do at night. On nights of the full moon, they were only flying by moonlight. And someone would stand in the field, 3 people would stand in the field with flashlights and hold them up in the shape of an L to show you the wind direction. So, 1, 2, 3. And you would flash Morse code at each other to make sure you were the right people who had set up to meet each other, an agreed on signal. And then you would hopefully land without, breaking your undercarriage. So if you were a Lysander pilot, you would have a little book like this to study. And it's got a little diagram of the aircraft. It's got a table of contents. It's got several pages worth, maybe 20 pages worth of close packed text telling you things like all about the armor plating and the first aid outfit and the front cockpit enclosure and the camera gun controls. And then it's got extensive diagrams of the interior of the cockpit. And it's got information in here somewhere, although I'm not sure where, for, takeoff and landing and emergencies and stuff like that. Here's another picture of the interior of the cockpit. And here's a diagram of the fuel system and how that works. If you were a ferry pilot, so if you were a transport pilot and all you were doing with this plane was picking it up in an airfield and taking it away to have maintenance done to it, you might not have ever flown it before. And what you would be given to prep you would be this. Remember, this is the page that's blank on the other side. Okay? So this notebook had, in the beginning of the war, they didn't even have this. This was something that they designed to, approach a need, because people were just getting, tips from mechanics on the airfield. And so they put this thing together, and it's ring bound so that you can add and take things away from it as new aircrafts come into use or old ones, sort of stop being used. And it contains about 90 instructions for about 90 different aircraft. I have not actually met and spoken to any Ravensbrück survivors, but I have actually had my paths crossed with some former ATA pilots. And one of them had a logbook that had listed in it 150 different types of aircraft. So they were really incredibly versatile, and expected to do it. The first time I did a school visit with this thing as show and tell, I left it in the school library. And the librarian called me in the taxi on my way back to the train station, and she said, you've left your ATA ferry pilot's notes here. I was like, I know, I have to return and get them. She said, it's a treasonable offense to lose your ferry pilot's notes. So, and I think my final piece de resistance of World War II paraphernalia is this, which is an escape map. Yeah. And this is what an airman would have in their kit in case they were shot down, along with, some supplies, a few rations, a knife, a compass. And you would have one of these maps, and hopefully it would help you to find your way back to safe territory. This dates to about 1940. The map itself is just a bicycle map. It's a tourist map. It doesn't show you anything about what's going on in the war, and it shows you the boundaries of countries. That's kind of it. And it shows you major road networks and rivers and stuff. But it's really, really large scale. So you really can't make out any detail. You would be hard pressed to find your way on foot using this map. It's of northern France, I think I said, and this bit just this little bit here is the southeastern coast of England. That's the bit you would be trying to get to. This is the English Channel. This bit, this is the rest of England. Okay? So that's all been blanked out so that if it falls into enemy hands, they won't be able to use it to navigate by. Yeah, London is like there. And there was a special operations executive agent, Christine Granville, who was stopped at a roadblock with an escape map on her person. And she sort of thought, oh no, what's going to happen to me if they find this? So while she was waiting to have her ID checked, she just tied it around her neck. And then when it came her turn, she handed over her ID, and nobody noticed that she was wearing this map as a scarf. So we've got I don't know how much time we have, but we've nearly been here for an hour. So I thought I would throw this open to you and see if anyone has any questions, because I'm happy to answer all manner of questions. And we have a roving microphone in case anybody does. Yes.
What was her mission when she was shot down?
Verity's mission in the book. My fictional. Oh, you mean Rose? In real life. These are all fictional. These books are fiction. They are fiction. One of them is on a mission, basically to bring down a small town administration, to bring down the occupying government administration in a small town. That's what she's sent to do. These planes, the air transport auxiliary planes, were unarmed, and so you basically had to avoid enemy aircraft fire. And so what happens in the first book, in Codename Verity, is that they actually do get hit. Their plane is not so damaged that it can't be landed, but it's so damaged. Well, it's so damaged that it's quite difficult to fly. And so one of the passengers parachutes out. The pilot then crash lands the plane. She manages to get it down, and she survives the crash. Well, I'm not going to tell you more about her mission because it gives away the plot. The other pilot in Rose Under Fire, she's not shot down. She's intercepted. She's lost. She is flying in France, which is no longer occupied by the Germans. It's after D-Day, and when she then lands at an airfield there, doing research on flying bombs and so it wasn't like I wasn't working on the book, but I just hadn't done the Ravensbrück research. And when I finally got to the point where I couldn't avoid it anymore, and I cracked open one of these books, I was really surprised at how full of hope and heart they were. So I had been dreading reading them because I was expecting this horrific tale of rape and torture, and really what I got was people so determined to survive and to help their friends survive. And what they all say is, I couldn't have done this alone. For what they all say is, I was lucky. That that's kind of the number one thing that gets you through. And number two is they couldn't have done it without friends. So it actually turned out to be very, very moving. And once I'd started, I didn't have trouble keeping going, and I was always very interested in learning more. And because they imprisoned so many women from all over Europe in this place, that one of the accounts I read was by a German woman, a German communist who was imprisoned there. There's one by a Polish countess. There's one by one of these women who were experimented on when she was 19. One by a French woman who was in the French Resistance. Another by Charles de Gaulle's niece, who was also imprisoned there. So really a real variety of people, and all with a slightly different tale to tell. And it was really fascinating. The one that was the hardest to read, some of these I had to read in French because they weren't available in English. And the one that was the hardest to read was a woman named Germaine Tillon, who took it upon herself to like collect numbers. She was one of these prisoners too, and she tries to keep herself out of it, you know, and she doesn't quite manage it. And her mother was in the camp with her, and her mother was gassed like 2 months before the liberation of the camp. So her mother was, I don't know, 60 years old, something like that. And they survived together for, 2 years under these appalling circumstances. And then we started executing people, and she didn't get lucky. So again, this comes into her account, but kind of slantwise, so she tries to keep her emotion out of it, and she can't quite do it. It's very, very moving and hard to read. But yeah, I mean, it was, the thing is, when you read so much of it, you got into their mindset. But it was a long, hard road. And I think that my family got really kind of fed up with me, telling them how lucky they were. Yeah. Anybody else? No? Am I working on something else? I am. No, it's not set during World War II, but it is set in the early 20th century, and it's got teen pilots in it, so kind of the same but different. Okay. Well, what's the next stage is I think I have to sit and sign books for people, right? Okay. Just again, thank you all so much for coming out here. It's really a pleasure to be here, if only for like 24 hours. I think it's less than that. And you've all been really welcoming, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
If anyone's watching on live stream and they wanted to get a signed book, they can call the bookstore 305-442-4408, and we can get it signed for you and ship it out. Otherwise, if you are here and you would like a signed book, they are for sale. Both books at the register, and Elizabeth will be signing here. Let's thank her one more time.